Well, good morning or good evening if you happen to be in Europe. I've got Randy from Grief and Grits with me today, and yeah, it's another conversation on grief. Um, but this time we're going to do something slightly different. Randy and I have known each other virtually for a while now, and we actually are both of the same mind where grief is concerned. We believe that a natural approach and a lifelong approach is the way to go. So, Randy, maybe you can explain a little bit about your history and take it from there.
I'd be happy to, and I'm honored to be here with you today to talk about the subject of my heart, because it's been a part of my heart since I was 10 years old when my dad died. And so I really did not understand what grief was about as a 10-year-old. And it was 1966, and people didn't talk much about grief and didn't really know what to do, and especially how to help children. And so it's really been my lifelong journey to understand what grief meant in my life, what it means in my life, how it shows up through the years. And so it really is a passion of mine to be able to help people understand that. And because I think grief is scary and hard, and it continues to show up in our life as our life goes on and moves along. And I think that when people don't understand that it's a lifelong process, that's when it becomes even harder and scarier and more confusing. And so I think it's owed to grievers to understand how grief can show up later, years later, and so that we're able to live with it, so that we're able to really make a life that includes our grief. And
Absolutely.
I want people to know that that doesn't have to be a scary thing. And so that's really what my passion is about in writing on Grief and Grits, writing a children's book, so that people will be able to hold their grief and embrace it and understand it. So I think that's what it means for me. Yeah. How about for you?
Well, just before I explain how I mean, I totally agree with you. You just mentioned your book, and I think that's a beautiful thing that you've done. I'd love viewers to know a little bit more about it, because Randy, I mean, your take on this is, having been a child that experienced traumatic grief, you have made it not only a part of your life and worked within the emotions, what I call living in grief, but you now have brought out this beautiful book in order to help children and help also the adults who are dealing with children in grief, how to talk to them about it. Could you just very quickly explain, because it is the most delightful book, and I would love you to share that with us.
Okay. Well, of course, I always have my book sitting next to me.
I don't have a copy. You can't get your book in Europe. We
Not
need to
yet.
find you a
Not
publisher
yet.
here.
Only in the US so far. But this is my book called Eddie's
Nice.
Brave Journey: How One Little Elephant Learned All About Grief. And yeah, my book is about a little grieving elephant because his grandpa Joe has died, and he sets out on a journey to learn how to deal with his great big feelings, and meets other animals who help him understand the different feelings that he's going through. And it's basically for our littlest grievers, who are between 2 and 3 and 8 years old. Although I think adults will enjoy it too. That the artwork is beautiful, and what I do in my book is offer honest language. I one of my other passions is making sure that people understand that euphemisms are not helpful for children.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we use words like lost and past and went to sleep and gone, it's really confusing for little children because they're so literal. You know, when we
Mm-hmm.
lose something, most of the time we find it. So if we lost daddy, why can't we go find him? So to me, it's very important that using the real language, the word died, um, it really is what helps children begin to understand and take in what has happened. And even as adults, you know, when we can say to somebody, I heard that your mom died and I want you to know I'm here for you, we're kind of letting somebody know that we can go to the deepest depths with them. We
Mm-hmm.
know this person has died and we are here for them. So that is really a very important part about my book, is getting to the real language, opening up conversation between the parent or caregiver that's reading the book with the child about how someone died, and really addressing all the different feelings that a child will.
It's the normalization of grief. I think
Exactly.
that's the part that for me is so important, to be able to have a conversation with anyone, be it children, people our age, or the elderly, and to be able to talk about grief that they may have experienced in perhaps years before or recently. I mean, the thing is that because our society is so grief averse, and people just don't have the experience or the support to have these conversations. I mean, that's what I particularly like about your book, that it gives adults the opportunity to actually start the conversation with children, that perhaps the children just don't know how to express themselves. And so there can be an interaction between them in a very natural setting. One of the things that I think people don't really appreciate is how far, I think, unfortunately, we've come the opposite direction from normalizing grief. I mean, I don't know how many people are aware, but the American Psychiatric Association, they have a book called the DSM-5, and this book is actually quite a sort of a huge book, and in it, they list all the different diagnoses that you can have for mental health. And unfortunately, the way that we seem to be going is in the wrong direction. There is a proposal at the moment to actually make grief a mental disorder. I don't want to go too much into that whole subject, but as a point of reference, I mean, when people hear this, they're rather surprised. And I think it's a reflection of where we've got to, that we just don't know how to talk about it. And so people end up at the doctors desperate for help. And one of the issues is that when you are at the doctors, if they decide that you are mentally disordered because you have got a grief condition, which to my mind is the most normal thing to have. It's a totally adaptive, normal response to the loss of someone you love. If they decide that that is a mental disorder, then you will be categorized and quite probably medicated for something that actually is a lifelong process. I'm not quite sure how we change that, except by making people more aware of what's going on, talking more about it. How do you see it, Randy?
Yeah, I mean, look, my dream would be that when somebody experiences the death of someone close to them and they begin the grief process and are needing assistance, or needing someone to talk to, needing help in understanding what's happening to their body, to their emotions, to everything that, and all the different ways that grief affects us. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to just go to a therapist and have insurance coverage because
Yeah.
you're sad and you're grieving and you're having a hard time, and there doesn't have to be any other reason other than that. So of course, yes, wouldn't it be wonderful if we if we were able to make sure that everybody just had the coverage they needed without having a defined disorder.
I mean, we tried to explore that last year. I don't know how many of the people listening to us participated or even were aware. We did a rather bizarre thing in some ways. We wanted to encourage people, it was in August, in fact, and we wanted to encourage people to explore their grief in a natural way, to put aside any concept or even intimation that there is a mental disorder associated with grief, and to actually go outside and experience their grief in nature or in the elements. And actually, it was very interesting for me to do that with you. It was a month's long project, if you can call it that. I don't know what word you would use, Randy. But
we didn't use challenge because we felt
exactly
challenging enough. Yes,
exactly. We didn't like the word challenge. We felt challenged enough as it was. But I thought it was a wonderful way of exploring this idea that grief can be incorporated in different ways into our lives, that we needn't be frightened of it, that even though it's very, very painful, the more we explore it and all its different elements, the more we get used to it and we can carry it and we can grow from it. And that, I think, is the main message that I would like to leave people with today, that fear is the one thing that, even though you might think, well, how can I avoid fear? Fear is the one thing that goes completely against living in grief. And how one deals with that element, I think, is by actually accepting, coming to a point of acceptance and allowing grief to live within us.
Yeah, I think it's an integration,
Mm-hmm.
really, between, in fact, I just had written something on Grief and Grits just about that, about our before and our after, and how do we integrate those two things. You know, the before, our hearts were shattered with the death of somebody close to us, and the after, where we're trying to make sense and live and figure out how we move forward without our person. And it really is an integration of our before and our after and how we do that. And I do think that the more people can understand that grief exists for a lifetime, and that doesn't have to be scary as much as an acceptance, like you said. And I just think that is the way people can begin to understand that grief is natural, and it's part of when we have loved somebody, and sometimes even we haven't loved somebody and it's been a challenging relationship, and then grief can be about all the things we missed or will never have.
Oh, well, that's a whole
other topic. Yes, absolutely.
Other grief when you didn't like the person.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
a very complex.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Anyway, Randy, thank you so much. And anyone listening to this, if you've got any comments or any questions, or you want to buy Randy's book, hold it up, Randy, hold your book up.
It's
fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book. And I mean, the illustrations are fantastic as well. I've seen the illustrations, even though I haven't held a copy in my hand. I will one day when this lockdown is over and I can fly over to California and we can meet in person. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll talk again very soon.
Good. I hope so.
Thank you.